Deltarune is a game about a lot of things. Freedom, choice, growing up, friendship, fate, but there is nothing in Deltarune more crucial than the theme of escapism. Escapism is a type of mental diversion from unpleasant aspects of daily life, typically through activities related to imagination or entertainment. So then what represents escapism in Deltarune? Well, what's the main setting of Deltarune? The Dark Roads. Escapism for every Lightner in Deltarune is the Dark Road, whether that be the Card Kingdom or Cyber Field. Every Lightner in Deltarune that enters a Dark Road uses it as some form of escapism, that escapism being the main way we can learn more about these characters. As Deltarune continues though, and as we come into chapters 3 and 4, that idea of escapism is shattered and these characters are forced to confront reality. Throughout this video, I'm going to cover every Lightner who enters a Dark Road in Deltarune chapters 3 and 4 and how they tie into the theme of escapism. This will be a pretty long video, so strap yourself in. Let's talk about some Deltarune. Berdly is definitely the Lightner with the least to talk about, but he acts as a really good starting point for this video. Berdly definitely fits into the theme of escapism, but in a less unique or interesting way, as he is often prioritized as comedic relief over actual characterization. A common trait between every character in this video is that these dark roads change our characters, leading them to discover new things about themselves or to open up more to people. These dark roads pretty quickly impact most Lightners in significant ways, but Berdly is definitely the character that changes the least throughout his dark road adventure. When first introduced, he's pretty much the exact same. At the start of chapter 2, he continues to defend Noelle like he does in the Light World, but in a much more extreme way. Instead of taking the blow of humiliation and reading for her at the start of chapter 2, he's now fighting the Fun Gang to, in his own words, protect her. Berdly uses the Dark Roads for a pretty selfish desire. In his introduction scene, he claims that he wants to turn the Dark Road into a Smartopia, where he and Noelle can be at the top of the food chain. While this is a much more goofy motivation than pretty much every other character in Deltarune, there is still a deeper meaning behind Berdly's motivation. Through the way Queen acts around Berdly, we can infer Berdly's parents are very neglectful to him, and he's often ignored. There are some other examples of this, like how in the second Berdly fight he panics when the werewires leave him, or Snowgrave where no one visits Berdly in the hospital. Berdly has a common theme of being abandoned or neglected, so Berdly's plan to turn the Dark Road into a utopia where he's the ruler really fits into what we know of him so far. Well, what else do we know about Berdly so far? He prides himself on being number one. In the Light World, he always claims he's the smartest, or number one in class. He always has to be at the top of something. This all circles back around to the main point. Berdly is just acting the same as he does in the Light Road, but in a much more extreme way. So far, we've only touched on Berdly's selfish motivations for the Dark Road, but there are other ways the Dark Road affects him. As the chapter continues, Berdly's role in chapter 2 focuses less on comedic relief and actually fleshing him out as a character. Off the bat, Berdly is meant to be an antagonist because of his plans of ruling the Dark Road, but during Queen's betrayal, it is revealed he primarily joined Queen so she wouldn't hurt Noelle. Berdly still clearly had that selfish plan in mind, and he definitely wasn't lying about wanting to rule the Dark Road based on his already established isolation, but it's an interesting touch that Berdly cared about Noelle enough to join Queen to save her. A lot of the subtle hints around Berdly's abandonment issues is all but confirmed in Queen's Palace, where we get Berdly's main backstory. He explains that for a long time he was an insignificant little bird, most likely due to all the neglect he got. Winning that spelling bee was the first time he ever got noticed, and since that's the one thing he's known for, he pushes the idea of being the smartest, whether that be in the Light or Dark Road. Berdly also explains that the main reason he's still number one in class is because Noelle studies with him. You could read that Berdly's main attachment to Noelle is out of a desperate attempt to keep him at the top of class, but based off a line later, Berdly is still nice when it's just him and Noelle. So he clearly does care about her, whether that be out of appreciation for her or the much more goofy explanation that he believes Noelle, the obvious lesbian, has a crush on him. So far, we've set up all the pieces of Berdly and his arcs during chapter 2, but how does this fit into the idea of escapism? Well, this moment of Berdly opening up, this moment of growth happens because of the Dark Road. Berdly being much more extreme and open allows characters like Susie to really get to him, like this moment in the palace. Berdly continues to pretend to dislike Kris and Susie in future chapters, but in the Dark Road he's far more open about his feelings. Berdly finds his place when he joins up with Kris and Susie, becoming actual friends with Susie, though he still doesn't really take it the right way. Berdly develops feelings for Susie, even though this is probably just because he's made an actual friend. However, he is much more open with Noelle in the Dark Road, so there are still positives to be found. While not perfect, these Dark Roads do make Berdly more attached to people, and in the Light Road throughout the rest of the game, Berdly thinks about being friends with Kris and Susie again. This Dark Road acted as a possible solution for him, or a means of escapism since he can't achieve it in real life. In the end, Berdly ends up being an ally and helps the Fun Gang defeat Queen. Berdly wakes up at the end of chapter 2 not accepting he could be friends with Susie and Kris, and that's mostly where we leave Berdly so far. He has some stuff here and there in chapter 4, but he's mostly the same with some slight changes. Berdly really hasn't finished his arc throughout these 4 chapters yet. While he does make friends in chapter 2 and lets go of the idea of being the smartest one, he decides to aim for being the dumbest one, which is obviously something that won't change his situation, isolation. Berdly really hasn't changed yet, he wasn't fully done with his arc in the Dark Road, and because of that, he hasn't really changed in the Light Road. Berdly is an isolated character with abandonment issues who is able to open up in the Dark Roads. He's able to make friends and not feel as isolated, but once we leave, he changes back to how he usually is. Berdly's arc isn't done yet, so it's a little disappointing ending here, but I really do hope we get more Berdly in future chapters, and we can wrap up his issues with isolation. Berdly is a good starting point. Every trait here besides the negative ones are felt with every other Lightner inside the game. So let's move on to the main characters. Noelle has a couple moments in Chapter 1, but just like Berdly, we're gonna skip right into Chapter 2. Once entering the cyber world, Noelle is quickly captured by Queen, and for the rest of Cyberfield, Noelle is mostly treated as this goal to reach, kinda acting as a stand-in for sealing the Dark Fountain. Obviously, this doesn't seem to be very interesting, and thankfully Noelle starts being characterized more once entering Cyber City, as she'll join your party. After this, Noelle no longer acts as a goal and actually becomes a main character, and this is where we get to flesh out her character and explore her connection to the Dark Road. One of the most obvious plots around Noelle in Chapter 2 is her relationship with Susie, or more simply, Noelle's confidence and how she gains it through the Dark Road. In Chapter 1, Rudy talks about how Noelle is afraid of everything like a deer in headlights. One of Noelle's fears, as we see in later chapters, is her mother, and in the Cyber Road, Queen becomes to a certain extent a more dangerous, less extreme Carol. For all of Cyberfield, Noelle is often unintentionally terrorized by Queen. Once we join up with Noelle in Cyber City, she still acts in fear. From the very first room, she jumps out of the way, afraid of the mice. This fear of mice is so focused on it literally becomes a core mechanic in puzzles. Focusing less on direct fear, Noelle also lacks the confidence to pursue anything related to Susie in Chapter 1 and 2. The opening scene of Chapter 2 is a good example of this, very fast-spoken and awkward. While spending more time with Noelle, we can see her panicking over this. The one moment we get of Susie throughout most of Cyber City is when we see Susie and Rouse eating cotton candy, and Noelle says she's not confident enough to approach her. However, as we progress, Noelle does gain more confidence by being exposed to things she's afraid of more and more. For example, Noelle eventually stops being afraid of the mice after interacting with them so much. By the time we join back up with Susie and Rouse, Noelle is a bit more confident. She often leads the charge with several puzzles, like coming up with a creative, faster solution for the mice puzzle. Later on, she even willingly gives herself up to Queen, someone she's been afraid of throughout the entire chapter. All of this slow character progression is paid off by the Ferris wheel scene between Susie and Noelle. Once the idea of the Dark Road being a dream is presented to her, she opens up to Susie a lot more. The Dark Road retroactively gives her the confidence to talk to Susie naturally on the Ferris wheel, and this confidence helps her in later chapters. Throughout Chapter 2, we slowly build up Noelle's confidence. We start with minor stuff like mice, then Noelle is able to gain confidence to talk to Susie, and finally, in one of the last moments in the Dark Road, Noelle stands up to Queen, someone who represents her mother. This Dark Road allows Noelle escapism in airing out her true feelings. This is of course being under the notion that everything is a dream. It's the same mindset as watching horror movies with Des. It might be scary, but she can just wake up and the nightmare can end. Besides gaining more confidence, Noelle is allowed to bond with Kris a lot more during Chapter 2. She's able to reconnect with Kris again, and we as the player are allowed to get a view at what the relationship was like when they were kids. Kris is implied to be someone who hides a lot of their feelings, so us as the player force some of those words out of Kris, giving Noelle some closure. I mean, of course, Kris probably doesn't want us to do that, but it's still good for Noelle. We don't really have to build on the relationship throughout much of Chapter 2 since Kris and Noelle already have a very strong bond. They work together on most of the puzzles, and Kris has some banter with Noelle without her control, with the Berdly statue dialogue. A good chunk of Noelle's screen time is dedicated to her redeveloping her relationship with Kris, but more importantly, all of Chapter 2 seems to let Noelle re-experience her childhood. Noelle has this very strange personal connection to the Dark Road, and it starts the moment we enter Cyber City. In the first battle, Noelle learns how to act based on her experience with Dragon Blazers, quickly connecting things from the internet into the Dark Road. To bring up Kris and Noelle's relationship again, there are puzzles that require Kris to prank Noelle, something Kris was notorious for doing as a kid. The main scene that really establishes this connection the Dark Road has with Noelle is Noelle's walk with Kris. If you don't think the Cyber City represents Noelle's childhood, then that's fine, but we have to agree this cutscene is a metaphor for Noelle and Kris's childhood. This adventure and her reconnecting with Kris brings the memories back, and during this walk she recites them. It's all pushed further as she unknowingly spells out December as they walk, and there are small glimpses of Noelle turning into a child underneath the shadows of the city. This scene virtually relives the memory of both Kris and Noelle's childhood, specifically Des. Noelle starts off Chapter 2 having a very bad time, but during Cyber City she seems to realize and now acknowledge that the city is better than her own life, and then it all comes flooding out during this hallway scene. She brings up how the adventures they've had in Cyber City reminds her of the adventures Kris, Azrael, Des, and Noelle would get up to, exploring the forest. When they used to explore, Noelle mostly remembers crying, but through this Dark Road she's gained the confidence to feel less fear, and now for the first time she's actually exploring a new world without fear in her eyes. To Noelle, exploring the Dark Road with Kris allows her to go back into that escapism of a time where Des wasn't gone, and the holidays and Dreamers were close. So we've established that that Berdly, Noelle, and Susie, as we'll get into in our own section, enjoy the dark road. So these three have used the dark roads as a form of escapism. Just keep that in mind, it'll come back. After Noelle stands up to Queen, Queen shuts down and tells Noelle to choose the world that makes her happy. Noelle in this moment decides that the dark road is actually better than her own life, or that this form of escapism is better than reality. They really spell this out to you. Susie and Noelle explain how the dark roads to them is a place where they don't have to deal with their issues, and that it's a world that is basically designed for them. After this, Berdly decides he should create another dark fountain so that this great adventure they've had can go on forever. Berdly in this moment finally lets go of his selfish goals and tries to create a dark fountain for everyone, in a land of eternal paradise. Then of course, when everything escalates, reality seeps back in. Rousey breaks this fun tone and delivers a monologue on the Roaring, an extremely dangerous apocalypse that occurs when a dark fountain is created inside of a dark road. The Titans would take form, destroying the entire world. These teenagers, thinking the dark roads are just fun adventures, are instantly handed an extremely serious dark situation if they keep messing around. For a brief moment, we get to see how serious and terrifying the potential of these dark roads will end up becoming if the fountains aren't sealed. But before we're able to think about that for too long, we were brought back to the silly tone of chapter 2, letting us re-enter this fantasy land. This bleak moment is used mainly as a motivation for Queen to stop her plans, and everyone quickly makes up. During this scene, you quickly forget about the Roaring. Sure, it's still serious, but for now, everyone's happy again. We're back to the silly ending for a chapter. And after that, everyone's arcs are wrapped up. Noelle ends chapter 2 a much more confident, open character. Noelle doesn't change a ton during chapter 4, but it's a lot more than Berdly. She's a lot more confident, but not quite to that level of being a fully changed character like she was by the end of chapter 2. Despite going through an entire journey, the idea of it all being a dream causes Noelle to not fully change. Noelle is a lot more happy and open though, and despite being afraid of a lot of things, specifically her mother, the adventure she went on clearly affected her, and I assume in future chapters we'll see Noelle more similar to Noelle at the end of chapter 2, especially if she re-enters the dark road and learns that what she went through wasn't a dream. Let's move on to Susie. Unlike Berdly and Noelle though, we have to go back to the start. Deltarune starts off very similar to Undertale. We start the story with Toriel waking Kris up, one of the main characters of Undertale, and as we go through Hometown in the opening cutscene, we see many characters from the previous game. Once we get to the classroom, everyone besides a couple random new characters are also in Undertale. These opening minutes and the Goner creation are meant to confuse you. Why is Alphys a teacher now? Why is Undyne a cop and doesn't have a missing eye? Is this a sequel to Undertale? Who is Kris? What is going on? These questions are never answered. Everything flips when Susie enters the classroom and we are forced to go with her to the closet. Susie mentions that her choices don't matter, something we've already heard from the mysterious narrator at the start of the game. This is the fundamental basis for Susie's character. Off the bat, Susie already interrupts the current story. We were supposed to just have a normal day in class, and before that, we were supposed to help Wing Gaster create a vessel. While Susie probably wasn't the one to interrupt the Goner sequence, she shares the same sentiment around her choices not mattering. Susie in chapter 1 puts on a very brash persona, not wanting to participate in anything. Once we enter Castle Town, she refuses to participate in Rousey's legend, claiming that she isn't a hero. After we fight Lancer, Susie leaves, leaving Rousey and Kris alone. For almost all of the Field of Hopes and Dreams, we never see Susie. We only hear of what she did. In an attempt to leave the Dark Road as fast as possible, Susie beats up every enemy in her way. Chapter 1 of Deltarune is meant to be a very standard, simple story. We have a traditional storyteller or legend, we have our wacky side characters, and a big bad tyrannical king we must take down. Lancer even calls himself the bad guy in his very first line. We are following a very standard story. The difference here is, well, Susie. Susie doesn't go along with the legend, she doesn't try to participate in any battles. In fact, she is only stopped by the puzzles, something that she has to put effort into. Susie's influence takes away greatly from the story that Deltarune is trying to tell. Susie is a character who rejects the potential escapism of the Dark Road, but slowly her walls fall down. Eventually, Susie is forced to join Kris and Rousey in order to progress. Once again, Lancer tries to stop us, but since Susie is here, she interferes, and just like she's done with everything else, doesn't stand for it. She picks up Lancer and threatens him to get out of our way, but Lancer obviously doesn't pick up on the hint and sees it as constructive criticism. Lancer is the first character so far to treat Susie like an actual person, instead of some sort of ferocious beast, and this slightly cracks her. After defeating K-Round, Rousey calls out Susie for not really helping during the fight, and this indirectly upsets Susie since Rousey is calling her unstable or a beast like everyone else in the Dark Road, and mostly everyone in the Light Road. This moment gives us a good reason for why Susie doesn't like the Dark Road. She's very much treated as an intruder, and the Dark Road becomes very similar to the Light Road, which is the opposite of escapism. This is is the main reason why Susie attaches to Lancer so much, because he's one of the only unique things about this dark road to her. For a lot of Susie and Lancer's development, it's mostly off-screen and only shown through subtle hints. The real showcase of their friendship is the long walk to Card Castle, where we get several moments of clear growth between Lancer and Susie. Once Lancer pulls out his ultimate stool form, Susie decides to give the candy to Lancer despite starving. This is really Susie letting down her walls, but for this one character, not everyone else. Anyways, this walk showcases Susie's growth throughout this chapter, but ironically during this scene, the character who hasn't grown enough is Lancer. Susie still has this strong belief of violence, and Lancer, realizing that we might have to fight his dad, betrays the fun gang and throws them in prison. It isn't fully explored why yet, but Susie throughout these chapters has really bad trust issues. She puts up massive walls so people don't really know who she is. Susie figuring out Lancer betrayed them immediately makes her put her walls back up, especially when he singles her out as the most dangerous out of the three. Now, just like the start of the chapter, Susie turns back into what everyone sees her as, a ruthless, unforgiving monster. During the Susie versus Lancer fight, she talks about killing Lancer again and again, but when the moment actually comes, she can't do it. Susie has threatened to kill characters multiple times and has clearly beaten up multiple Darkners, but she isn't really capable of killing someone. Once forced to hurt someone, she shows she can. Susie assures Lancer that if he doesn't want them to fight his dad, they can just talk it out. This shortly gets paid off in the elevator scene, where Susie decides to actually learn to battle non-violently so that she doesn't have to kill the king. Once she finally opens up to Kris and Rousey, she officially joins the party. Throughout chapter 1, Susie firmly avoids the narrative and general story, just wanting to leave the dark road. But throughout the forest and during this elevator scene, she attaches herself to Lancer, Kris, and Rousey. She's now fully on board with their adventure, and throughout the rest of the chapter, she listens to what Kris says. After the king fight, Susie backs up her team and saves Kris when knocked down by King. It's a bit of a full circle moment. Susie starts showing her true colors here, and it's shown pretty well once she starts showing her eyes. Throughout the chapter, Susie is always hiding her face, and she only starts showing her eyes when saving Kris, being the real endpoint for her arc. After we say goodbye to everyone, Susie asks if we can come back tomorrow, showing she's gained a real friendship with Kris. Susie is a bully at the start of this chapter, but throughout this fantasy land, she slowly opens up her walls and becomes real friends with people, and most importantly, becomes real friends with Kris. While she is at first very against the dark road, she eventually opens up to it and ends the chapter a much nicer person. The real Susie, not the Susie we saw at the start of chapter 1. With Susie's main arc in chapter 1 done, we've done most of the setup. It's time for chapter 2. There is some stuff to discuss with Susie before we enter the cyber world, so let's get that out of the way first. We have some quick signs of insecurity when she asks Kris if they'll still be friends if the dark road isn't real, but once it is revealed to be real, Susie quickly goes back to her normal self. In Castletown and later on in Cyber Road, Susie keeps talking about the dark roads as these fun adventures. She uses the Cyber Road and Dark Road as a very light-hearted form of escapism, mainly wanting to avoid doing her school project. Susie really just sees the Cyber Road and more generally chapter 2 as a fun adventure with her friends, mainly just wanting to forget about the real world. Her motivation is much more light-hearted than every other Lightner, unless there's a deeper motivation that we haven't seen yet, but during chapter 2, it just seems like she's having fun. Kind of like how someone can get distracted by the internet instead of working. Susie definitely gets the least focus, or at least the smallest amount of development out of every Lightner in chapter 2. Noelle and Berdly all have their own solo arcs and take up major screen time. The main thing Susie does in chapter 2 is bond and grow relationships with people through the dark road. One of the only bonds Susie had that wasn't fully developed in chapter 1 was Rousey, and that's pretty much resolved by chapter 2. After falling into Cyber City, we have a really strong moment where Rousey heals Susie, and because of this, Susie considers learning healing magic from Rousey. Now that Susie is more open, she's allowed to develop more, and this allows Rousey and Susie to grow a lot closer. After this, Susie drags Rousey away from Kris so they can have their own adventure. Off-screen, Rousey teaches Susie healing magic, and because of this, they become better friends. Lancer was probably the character that Susie had the strongest relationship with in chapter 1, and we get to see more of their bond in chapter 2. Susie and Lancer spend a lot of time together throughout this chapter without realizing it. Lancer is in Kris's pocket the entire chapter, so he's kinda just there for the whole ride, and once let loose, he and Susie get to talk a bit about the fun adventure they just had. Susie often avoids her feelings in chapter 1, but the moment Lancer starts turning to stone, she fully panics and tries to save him. Both Rousey and Lancer are the two Darkners Susie already knew well, and they are further developed here. What's interesting about this is that Susie doesn't really make any real friendships with Darkners in chapter 2. Queen kinda counts, but her relationship with Susie isn't as close as Rousey or Lancer. Every other bond Susie creates or develops are with Lightners or real people. Kris is the only Lightner Susie became friends with in chapter 1, and their bond grows even closer in chapter 2. We get a real reflective moment on the relationship in the ending cutscene for this chapter. In the scene, Susie talks about how great it would be if the Dark Road and Light Road could be merged together, so that all her friends could be in one place. Kris also has some clear signs of bonding with Susie, as they only answer honestly if you tell Susie that they want to take her to the festival. It's a moment that really reflects how much these two have bonded. Susie grows a lot closer to Noelle, and kinda Berdly, although their relationship doesn't carry over to the light road. For most of chapter 2, Susie develops new friendships and connections, but she also further connects to characters from chapter 1, dark or light. As Susie states when sealing the dark fountain, the roaring night creating these dark fountains might have actually been a good thing. So far in these dark worlds, she's this awesome hero and has made way more friends than she could in real life. Chapter 2 is a moment for her to fully attach herself to the dark world and her friends, and this is where chapter 3 rears its ugly head and destroys all of it. We start chapter 3 waking up in a newly created dark world. Susie is at first confused, but quickly gets excited and ready to experience another adventure. Susie recites a lot of what she had just said to Kris to Rouse in the opening cutscene, but unlike Kris, Rouse is a darkner and can't relate or do any of the things Susie is saying. After being pressured by Susie, Rouse drops the absolute bombshell that none of the dark worlds are real, that every fun adventure Susie had was just a fantasy. Lancer, the first person to ever look up to and compliment Susie, the person who made her invested in the first place, was nothing more than just a playing card. And the person telling her this, the friend she had grown closer and closer to, wasn't real either. It's a shattering moment that breaks a lot of the fun and whimsy Susie got out of the dark worlds, especially the bonds and friendships she had formed. If that wasn't enough, all of this is made worse by Rouse's finishing sentence. Go find some real friends, okay? Something that Susie is still clearly unable to do without a dark world's help. She began relying on the dark worlds for this, and it just shattered. As Tenna's game show goes on, Susie seems to be having a fun time like she normally does, but she does occasionally crack. When seeing Lancer again, Susie offhand catches herself calling him fake. She even outright thanks Tenna for hosting the game, since it took her mind off what happened earlier. By the end of chapter 3, we don't really know how deeply this revelation affected her, and it's only further developed in chapter 4. But there is still a lot more to talk about with this chapter and Susie's role in it. The main thing that makes chapter 3 distinct from the rest of Deltarune is that we can directly see what our characters are attempting to avoid through the dark world. In every other chapter, we have to read into the subtext of the characters, but here, specifically for Susie, we can see directly that she's using Tenna's fun game show to distract herself from the dark worlds not being real. As said before, she directly thanks Tenna for taking her mind off things. It's very interesting how when Tenna shows up, he quickly cuts off this very serious moment with Rouse and Susie before bombarding them with a ton of jokes, distracting visuals, and exciting music. Tenna, acting as a game show host, attempts to distract everyone from the situation Susie and Rouse were just in by constantly trying to entertain them. Obviously, after such a serious bombshell, Susie is not having it, giving a very similar reaction to how she would act in chapter 1. However, Rouse and Susie both eventually agree to try the game show out. Since the dark worlds are now revealed as fake, being on a fake game show seems to fit right with both of them. And throughout the chapter, they mostly try to ignore what happened at the start. You can briefly talk to Susie on how she's doing, and she tells Kris that she always figured the dark worlds were too good to be true. You could see this as a moment of Susie accepting her situation, and she might have, but as we'll see later, that isn't the case. Anyways, once Tenna is found out, the entire fun game show is dropped, and it instantly turns into a game of Tenna desperately attempting to get some enjoyment out of Kris. This is where that fake escapism breaks, and we see the cracks in Tenna's character. It seems everything goes back to normal after escaping Tenna, since the gang have a fun adventure in the TV world with some goofy bosses, but that also eventually breaks. Once finishing TV world, Tenna redeems himself before quickly being killed by the Roaring Night. The Night showing up is a real moment of terror. The Night that Susie talked about in a positive light previously is now staring her in the face after murdering Tenna and trying to kidnap Toriel. It really establishes to us and Susie that this thing is a lot more dangerous than anything else so far. This is a fight they cannot win. After this moment, the Dark Worlds are not presented as silly adventures. The Night is a real creature in the real world that can enter the Dark Worlds and very easily kill our heroes. This is the point where that illusion of escapism is once again broken for Susie. The first lines we get of chapter 4 is proof of this. Susie mirrors what she said in chapter 2, talking about how these Dark Worlds have leaked into the real world. Undyne is gone and Toriel was almost kidnapped. The opening sections of chapter 4 are really silly, but there's always that lingering sense of dread after the events of chapter 3. When waking up, Susie acts the same, talking about church with Toriel and having a good time. She does offhand mention Tenna a couple times, and she also only goes to church because it's close to the shelter, but they're only brief moments that are quickly overshadowed by goofy jokes. During church, Susie just drinks a ton of fruit juice, and during Noelle's house, she just flirts with Noelle a ton. Even when there are potentially scary moments, she still remains calm and confident. Throughout the entire Light Road, she acts her usual self. It's only once entering Castletown that she instantly starts talking about Undyne and the Roaring Night. Her main connection to the Dark Road now is the danger of it because of chapter 3. She's clearly affected by the night and the threat it holds on her. The Dark Roads have stopped being these fun adventures to distract herself, since she can get that out of the Light Road now. Rouse tells Susie Susie not to worry about the night and to treat Castletown as a place to go when the real world gets too overwhelming, which is an obvious form of escapism. Susie agrees to calm down, and after this, she's fine until we enter the church. Susie for the most part still acts the same, but she quickly goes back to her much more aggressive, panicky self once seeing the night. And just like that, we've gone back to the same tone as the end of chapter 3. The goal of these dark roads aren't having fun. They're primarily on saving Toriel, Undyne, and defeating the night. Ironically, the dark road itself is notably much more serious. It's all on the prophecy and the future. Because of this, Rousey throughout this entire chapter is very focused on making sure Susie and Kris don't read the final prophecy. And because of that, throughout most of this chapter, the gang is very disjointed and off. Susie tries to recreate their previous bond, but it often feels performative. Susie and Rousey are both still Susie and Rousey, but they're much more focused on a specific goal instead of just enjoying themselves, like previous chapters. All of the serious, foreboding vibes that chapter 4 give off is quickly taken away by Gerson Boom, a silly old man that at first annoys Susie but makes this chapter a lot more similar to the goofy adventures of chapters 1, 2, and sometimes 3. Susie is still often annoyed by him but becomes much more attached to him once he implies that he's a Lightner. Susie thinks he's real and therefore is a lot more open to getting to know him, since so far she hasn't made any close bonds with Darkners after learning they weren't real. Gerson is the first real character to connect to Susie again. After how bad her last journey ended up being, she kind of needs a mentor figure, someone who teaches and reminds her how valuable she is. Gerson ends up being the character she connects to the most since chapter 2, even sparking some old thoughts. In the Gerson fight, Susie says that she wishes these adventures could go on forever, that she could always make new friends. Gerson re-sparks old thoughts inside of Susie and acts as a form of hope. Gerson also acts as a teacher. He indirectly teaches her better healing, something she wants to know more than anything. He's able to bring back the tone of a silly adventure. He reattaches Susie to the dark road and even teaches her new skills. Gerson is great and extremely important to Susie, and this is when everything comes crumbling down. Susie and Kris look for a code for a locked door and decide to find Gerson in the light road for help, only to reveal that Gerson has long passed and the man they were talking to was a ghost. The first real friend and mentor Susie made since chapter 1. The first person she could talk to again was a Darkner and thereby not real. Susie is upset but decides to honor him by writing the letter he wanted her to write. But not all hope is lost. Susie creates a new dark fountain to find Gerson again and hopefully see if he has the code for the door. At the start of chapter 4, Susie still associates the dark roads with danger, but here she embarks the dark road head on because she's using it as escapism again. Yes, the old man is dead in real life, but she could find him again and revive him. She's using it for escapism again. She even mentions later in the second sanctuary that they could take what is basically his corpse and keep him in Castletown, virtually making him alive forever. She's using the dark road to keep Gerson alive so she doesn't have to grieve. And this is where chapter 4 once again completely shatters any and all escapism. Ironically, once Susie starts diving into escapism, the second sanctuary turns into another silly adventure with fun enemies and wacky, ridiculous puzzles. Susie gets to open up to Kris again, talking about how important this prophecy is, and how her being a hero means so much to her. She's pretty much back to her old self, but that soon changes once we find Gerson. Due to Susie being the one to make the fountain, when Susie finds Gerson, he ends up as a mangled corpse attempting to kill her. That escapism of hoping to bring Gerson back is gone, and one of her closest friends kills him instantly. All of that build-up, Rousey telling her he and Lancer aren't real, the night turning the dark road into a serious, dangerous journey, Gerson being dead not once but twice, it all builds up to this moment where Susie screams at Rousey about everything he said since chapter 3, even how he never mentioned the roaring until chapter 2. It shows that despite acting like she got over it, Susie never really got over the fact that the dark roads weren't real. And for the first time, Susie resorts back to how she was at the start of chapter 1, someone disconnected from the dark roads. After it all, Rousey explains his deal, and Susie calms down once learning that he did it all to protect her. Chapter 4 begins to rise in hope again. They find the code and trek onto the third sanctuary. In a very similar scene to chapters 1 and 2, all the NPCs you've helped out save the gang from the night and raise them up to face their greatest foe. Susie's extremely confident against the night, fitting her role as the girl with hope crossed on her heart. Unfortunately, the night creates a titan and they have a large battle with it. And Gerson shows up again. He wasn't dead after all. Chapter 4 ends on a hopeful, climactic finale where Susie and Kris are somehow able to defeat a titan. But that's not where this chapter ends. After such a hopeful, climactic ending, that feeling is shattered when Susie finds the true end of the prophecy, the one thing Rousey has been trying to prevent. Susie reads the prophecy and smashes it with her fist. When Rousey finds her, she laughs it off, claiming that it couldn't be real. Susie mentions several times how important this prophecy feels to her, how her being this hero helps her come to make terms with herself. And now with this terrible fate coming up, she either has to accept that she isn't a hero, or she has to accept that what's going to happen is not preventable. As we've established though, Susie's a character that can break the narrative. From the very beginning of the game, she breaks the story, and maybe she can change the fate of the world. Because of this, Chapter 4 doesn't end on a solely depressing ending. It's still bitter, but there is hope crossed on Rousey's heart. This is only between Rousey and Kris though. Susie still ends this chapter afraid and concerned about what will happen next. The initial idea of escapism through Dark World seems to be fully gone. In future chapters, other new characters will probably keep representing these themes, but for our main characters, especially Susie, that idea will most likely stop. She will start to get more enjoyment out of the real world, and like Rousey says, she will make some real friends. The real question is, will she forget everyone else? Kris is a strange character. It's hard to read into them because they're a character that we don't personally know a lot about. For all of Chapter 1, Kris is presented as a blank slate, and almost all choices besides a few details are made by us, not Kris. I mean, you could say Kris is pretending to be a blank slate to distract us, but you could also say the ending cutscene for Chapter 1 is the first time Kris regains control of their body. The real focus and struggle of Kris's segment is answering the question, what do the Dark Fountains mean to them? Is it escapism? Well, that question is not going to be answered in Chapter 1, so we're just going to skip to Chapter 2. For most of Chapter 2, it is confirmed Kris likes Susie and at least tolerates Rousey. It can also be implied that they like Noelle because they were childhood friends, and they also have some jokes with her that aren't controlled by the player. So for the most part in Chapter 2, they seem to be having a good adventure like Susie. The real unique thing for Kris in Chapter 2 is Spamton G. Spamton. Spamton is a character that Kris meets when they are alone, one of the few times two characters are alone in Chapter 2. Kris backs away from Spamton very quickly once he mentions the soul. This is the only mention of Kris's soul by any character so far, and it clearly scares Kris. After that, Spamton leaves and things go back to normal. What's interesting is if you pursue Spamton later in the game. Kris doesn't want Susie and Rousey to follow them, so it's just Kris and Spamton again, showing a clear connection between the two. Spamton and Kris's deal is very interesting. It can be implied that Kris has a deal with the Knight, so there's an obvious parallel there. But what's more interesting is that we help Spamton enter a new body, one that he believes will bring him freedom. Isn't it interesting that Kris, a character who most likely wants to have control over their own body to regain freedom, helps Spamton enter a new body that they believe will bring them freedom? If we take that parallel of Kris and the Knight, Kris acts as a metaphorical second Knight, so in this deal, Spamton fills the role of Kris and Kris fills the role of the Knight. Once entering the Mettaton body, Spamton quickly realizes that what he really needs for freedom is the soul, or the player. Again, his acknowledgement of the player freaks Kris out. While this is cut off by Rousey and Susie, Kris is still visibly shook by this, screaming that they are not okay after defeating Spamton. Kris just met and defeated someone going through the exact same situation as them. So there was some interesting stuff here, but based off Chapter 2, we still can't answer those initial questions. But we are starting to see more layers to Kris as a character. Chapter 3 is the one Dark Fountain we can confirm was created by Kris, and through this we can see how Kris partially relates to the theme of escapism, although not in a way you would expect. The Dark Road isn't literal escapism, it's showing us more of Kris's past and how they use television to hide away from their real life. Tenna attempts to get Kris's attention multiple times with warm nostalgia. The cooking show is meant to remind them of Azrael, and the rock concert is meant to remind them of Des. While Tenna might not be doing this on purpose, we can see very clearly that Kris looked up to these two, especially as a child. What makes this even more interesting is when Tenna goes mask off and that fake escapism fades away. The cooking game becomes barren and dark, and the rock concert is empty. Once we start seeing reality, we can see Kris's current mental state. Azrael is gone, and Des is literally gone. You can even read this as Kris being empty without Azrael or Des. Only when Tenna goes mask off does he stop trying to comfort Kris, which is when he drops the family is fighting again line. Through this, we can read that TV comforted Kris during their parents' divorce, and now the TV is off, and Des and Azrael are no longer around. Everything around Kris's role in Chapter 3 is summarized so well with Ram's talk to Kris about how he saw them create the Dark Fountain and asks them if it was just to experience fun again. While this Dark Fountain was most likely part of Kris's unknown plan, did Kris also make this to re-experience some of their childhood? It's unclear, but it's not far off to believe it could be both. We also explore more of Kris through the Shadow Crystal route. Iram, or Friend, is an even more extreme version of Spamton. They are fully aware that Kris is under control by us and mock them for it. The Night Boss also confirms that Kris and the Knight are working together, and that Kris is a metaphorical second Knight since they are knighted at the end of their boss fight. So we've set up everything we know about Kris so far through chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now what are they getting out of the Dark Fountains? Well, it's freedom, and more importantly, Des. Kris rips out their soul and risks everything once you enter Des's room in chapter 4. While it is to stop the player from seeing the shelter code, Kris could also be doing this out of exhaustion from having to be inside Des's room for an extended time. Off the flavor text from Des's room, you can see that Kris had a close bond to Des. Des went missing, but we really don't know how. Only the ending dialogue from Caro in chapter 4 confirms that Kris promised to help her. But why? Was Kris responsible for Des disappearing? Kris isn't an evil character, it would be extremely weird if they were, so it was probably an accident that led to Des's disappearance. I believe these dark worlds are escapism in the form of a desperate need to relive their childhood and bring Des back from the dead. Based off chapter 4, the idea of the dead coming back to life from the dark road is set up, so we could assume that Des is dead and the only way to see her again would be in the dark road. However, based off how the plot seems to be going and the fact that Des is probably the knight, Kris is most likely being manipulated for a greater scheme. And once again, just like everyone else, their escapism will eventually shatter and they will have to confront the reality of their situation, potentially losing all their relationships in the process. Kris is actually the only character in this video to not have their escapism destroyed yet, and because of that running theme, it can be assumed that this will eventually happen to Kris in future chapters. And that's pretty much all the Lighteners and their connection to escapism. Wait. Berdly and Noelle haven't had their escapism broken. They're doing fine, if not better, in chapter 4. Is there no explanation for that? Oh. Let's talk about Berdly first, since he's a lot more simple than Noelle. There is a little more to talk about him than just dying though. Berdly at this point in the game has been treating the Dark Road as this potential paradise, or a smart Toby as he says. In the usual game, he calls Kris a kidnapper and beats up Noelle and Kris for no real reason. However, in Snowgrave, he instantly senses Noelle is actually in danger and he drops his goofy motivations, fully focusing on saving Noelle. Berdly's silly motivations are quickly turned serious, and after a bit, Noelle kills him. We push past not just the shattering of escapism, but the actual shattering of reality. Berdly dies through these dark roads, and in the light road he enters a coma. It's the real first moment in this game where the dark roads actually affect someone in the real world physically, and this example is still far more extreme than Undyne being kidnapped or anything the Knight does. Okay, so that's Berdly, but Noelle is the real focus of Snowgrave. Noelle technically learns the same lesson she does in the normal route. She becomes less afraid and gains more confidence. In fact, Noelle grows more social skills than she does in the normal route. It's the way that we get to this point that are more extreme. Noelle doesn't actually bond or grow relationships with anyone during Snowgrave. She only interacts with Susie briefly off screen. Any other relationship is severed. She kills Berdly and interacts with us instead of Kris. Almost all positive experiences she has in the normal route are taken away from her. There isn't much more to talk about in chapter 2. I'm sure most people know how Snowgrave goes. After Noelle kills Berdly, she leaves and she only comes back to kill Spamton, giving us a soulless, lifeless ending. Now that was all we had for a while, but chapter 4 is where things start getting interesting, and the theme of escapism once again starts to appear. In between chapter 2 and 3, Kris goes back to the library and takes Berdly to the hospital, then goes to Noelle's house to tell her everything they did was a prank. Through this, Noelle is allowed to find peace, thinking her entire experience in chapter 2 was just a bad dream. She finds relief in the light road, and the dark road goes from a fun adventure into a nightmare she tries to ignore. Ironically, the light road becomes escapism for Noelle. She uses the positive experiences there as a way to cope and shield herself from reality. A good example of this mindset is the Ferris wheel scene in the normal route, where Noelle tells Susie about horror movies. It's scary, but I can just turn it off, right? What happened during Snowgrave to Noelle is like a horror movie. In that period of time, she couldn't turn it off, but now that she has turned it off, she's free to act like it was a bad dream. Noelle thanks Kris for bringing her relief, only for us to possess Kris and begin talking to Noelle again. That illusion of the nightmare finally being over is proven wrong as it begins to bleed back into the real world. While Noelle tries to convince herself it wasn't real, we directly tell Noelle that their dream happened. Once we take out the thorn ring, Noelle instantly recognizes it. She hasn't stopped thinking about her nightmare, and once we put the thorn ring back in her, we create a new soul inside her body, causing the nightmare to fully bleed back into the real world and have real consequences. Snowgrave takes a twist on the theme of escapism. Instead of the dark roads representing fun adventure, the light road for Noelle becomes a form of comfort only for the dark roads, or what happened in the dark road, to creep back in. Combining the regular route of chapter 4, Susie, Berdly, and Noelle all end chapter 4 with their concept of escapism gone. Noelle ends the chapter accepting what happened to her and invites Kris to the festival to do God knows what. Even Kris, someone we don't know a lot about, is significantly more miserable during chapters 2, 3, and 4, just barely pushing through for their plan. Everyone in Snowgrave has been affected, and everyone's idea of escapism or comfort is gone. Deltarune is a game about a lot of things, but the main theme is escapism. Every single Lightener is built around this idea, and eventually reality seeps in for all of them. Having a game that tackles escapism this thoroughly in so many different ways allows many people to relate to it, and for me, I relate to pretty much everyone mentioned in this video. I don't relate to Berdly's goofy motivations or isolation problems, but his consistent references to forms of media or honestly just his general vibe kinda reminds me of me sometimes. Noelle's connection to childhood is so relatable to me. Finding what you enjoyed as a child in different forms forms of media is something I constantly strive for. Susie growing up and accepting her harsher realities is something that's slowly happening to me more and more. Having a game that directly tells you this is so impactful, especially when you've grown up and matured with these characters as the years have gone by. And lastly, I want to look exactly like Kris, just less non-binary. Look, I had to come up with something to wrap this up, but there you have it. That was my video on Deltarune and the illusion of escapism. It kinda sucks I had to end on a darker note, but that's just Deltarune for you, I guess. This was my first ever attempt at a video essay and analysis. I think the research and points here are accurate because I know Deltarune pretty well, but I probably made some mistakes, so if I messed anything up, you're free to comment any feedback. If you want to add on to anything in this video, you're also free to do that because I would actually be really interested in hearing how much deeper this topic can go. For the future of Deltarune, I assume that escapism will eventually shatter for Kris, plus any other new Lightners who enter Dark Roads will probably fit into that theme of escapism, especially if Kris and Susie won't fit into the theme anymore. I have seen other videos in my feed about escapism in Deltarune, but I've purposely avoided them while making this. I unironically thought I had an original idea when writing this, but I definitely did it, and that's my bad. Since I was already pretty deep into the video when learning others had done this, I just decided to not watch anything else and make this video all on my research and my thoughts. I have no idea how similar this is to anything else, and I really hope it isn't, but we'll just see how it plays out. I make a lot of content that aren't just video essays, and most of it probably won't be for you, but if you want to see more Deltarune content, I've ranked every Deltarune song, so if you want any more content related to Deltarune, be sure to check that out. I mostly do videos on film though, so if you think that content might be for you, I have a ton of that. Thanks for watching, and this is an epic outro.